Flyinbrian is back. It's a project day. I'm going to clear out the garage, get my equipment out, and start working on a table. The table's got to look something like this. I've already drawn up a set of rough plans made from basically 2x4s and a piece of 1/2 inch plywood. Each one of the parts, there's the top. It's already been based, they're rough drawn. These are not to scale, and it's just rough drawn. And I'll just cut the parts up, and if all goes well, they should fit together like a big puzzle. So I'm gonna get started on it. All right, I've got my garage pretty much set up. There's my Shopsmith table saw behind me. Over here is the dust collector. I just use a couple of sawhorses with a 1/2 inch piece of plywood, 3/4 inch piece of plywood. That is my worktop here. I purposely designed this to use nothing but basically 2x4s, old 2x4s, and a piece of plywood I have left over. And that's what we have here, just old 2x4s. Some of them are even pressure treated lumber, but still it's just a simple, quick and dirty table I'm going to make. And it shouldn't cost me anything but my time and the electricity. Some of the first things I will make are the sides and the legs. And I have them, what is that, 5/8 of an inch thick by 3 inches tall, and all that will be able to be cut from a standard 2x4 and then milled and planed down to the proper size. I start by laying out the rough length of the parts on the 2x4 stock. When done, I head to the table saw. Oops, need to crank the speed up on the motor. I begin rough cutting out the parts to a size slightly larger than needed. This will become the front and back frame parts. This will become the 2 side frames. Two of the table legs, and the other 2 legs. I now run the rough cut 2x4s through the saw and cut off a small slice of the edge. This does a couple of things. One, it trues up the edge of the lumber for a perfect 90-degree surface, and it also gives me a nice sharp edge on the corners of the part. And yes, it looks like my fingers are getting close to that blade, but they're not as close as it appears, and I am well aware of that blade. Besides, life is always more enjoyable with a little bit of risk added in. You bungee jumpers and skydivers know what I'm talking about. I cut this piece right down the center, which will form 2 of the 4 table legs. And the second pair of table legs. I've adjusted my saw fence to exactly 3 inches. I run that nice flat edge I cut just a minute ago along the saw fence and cut the 2x4 to exactly 3 inches wide, the finished height of the top frame pieces. Now that the top frame pieces are all cut to the proper height, I need to rip the 2x4 down its length to form 2 pieces which will become the top frame parts. These should end up being slightly thicker than 5/8 of an inch called for in my plans, which is exactly what I want. I will use my planer to machine them to the correct thickness a little later. saw blade is not tall enough to make this cut in one pass, so I will need to flip the stock over and run it through again. Here's another one going through the saw as I play this little game of Where's the Saw Blade? Okay, we have 4 legs, and we have 2 side frames and 2 the front and back frames, all cut to rough size. Now I've got to plane them down to the proper thicknesses and trim them to the correct lengths. Here I am running the top frame parts through the planer to machine them down to exactly 5/8 of an inch as called for in the plans. Each pass of the planer takes off a fraction of an inch and also machines the board perfectly flat. I measure their thickness in between passes, make small adjustments to the planer height, and continue this process until they are the correct thickness. I do the same with the table legs. Their final dimension is 1 1/4 inches square. So I run them through once on one side and once on the other and then take a measurement. Once I get to exactly 1 1/4 inches, I am done. The parts all now have the correct height and thickness. Now I need to work on cutting the parts to the correct length. I start by cutting off a small piece of the end of each part. This gives me a perfect 90-degree machined end on the piece. I have my saw fence set up as a length gauge to assure the table legs are all cut to precisely 29 1/4 inches. I butt the end I just cut off against the block I have clamped to the fence and run the leg through the saw. I do the same process to the top frame parts. When done, all parts are now cut to their correct lengths. Time has come to miter the ends of the top frame, and basically what I'm going to do is use the miter saw, just lop those off like this. Here's a look at one of the miters. I've swapped out the saw blade for a dado head and carefully set up my fence and dado head so that it will cut a 5/16 by 1/2 inch recess in my top frame parts. I carefully run the parts over the table to machine in the dado. Have you ever had a dado head come munching its way up through the piece you're milling? Well, I have, and let me tell you, it's no day in the park. While I have out the dado head, I will also mill out the slots in the table legs. One of the last pieces to be cut is the tabletop. This first pass over the saw will free up a rough-sized part from the larger sheet of plywood. Pushing a sheet of plywood like this through the saw and using the fence as a guide is not without risk. It can potentially bind between the saw blade and the fence and kick back. But what the heck, I like a challenge. No injuries, I call that a success. I've readjusted the fence and now I will cut the part to its finished width. And now cut it to its finished length. This is another one of those dicey cuts. But sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. The parts are done. There's the tabletop, 4 table legs, the top frame parts, the footrail parts. The next step is to take all these parts and assemble them into a finished table. Not to be confused with a finished table. But that will need to wait for another day. Look for part 2, and remember, life is a journey. Enjoy the ride, and thanks for watching.